Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Iwhite Oka te maunga, ko Niger te awa, ko New Zealand te waka, ko Ozumba Ekigbo te whānau, ko Jennie Ekigbo tōku ingoa. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for joining me today at this session. There's been such an amazing lineup of speakers here at the Justice Conference this year, so I'm really glad that you decided to join me here in this session. So let's get into it. We only have a really short amount of time, and the topic of racial justice is massive. It's really broad, really deep. We could spend months talking about it. People have done masters and PhDs on it, so we're not going to do that. We're just going to take one small slice of it, just looking at what Christians in Aotearoa New Zealand can learn from this current moment, the Black Lives Matter moment, and how we can take these learnings and use it to help us further the kingdom of God. So I want to start by saying that racial justice is a messy, grey topic. It's very uncomfortable and very much unlike topics like children who are being exploited for either sex slavery or other forms of modern day slavery. So it can appear that there's no clear victim, no pure victim that we can write in and save. And also, as we've come to understand with many other issues of justice, there is a huge element of us being complicit in perpetuating racial injustice, all of us being involved in that. So if we pivot back to this current moment, I want to just briefly recap on what led us to where we are today. So as you may recall, a few months ago, an African-American man was filmed with a police officer kneeling on his neck for just shy of 9 minutes before he eventually died. This sparked nationwide protests led by the African-American community under the banner of Black Lives Matter. We also saw international protests as well, led predominantly by the African diaspora community, and that was no different here in Aotearoa New Zealand as well. The collective groups that helped organise the protests, particularly in Wellington and Auckland, were led by groups of African, Māori and Pacifica young people, as well as Pākehā young people. So Africans were very much at the forefront of that. And if you've been paying attention, you'll also know that the murder of George Floyd in front of our very eyes was more like the straw that broke the camel's back for the African American community, because the last 7 years have been pretty tough, with a large number of high-profile cases of African American people being killed by law enforcement for very frivolous and ridiculous reasons and not receiving any form of justice. But the thing is, the disproportionate targeting of the African American community is not a new phenomenon. It's merely being recorded and shared via social media platforms, and so it can reach many more people at a much faster rate. If you go back 30 years, some of you might be young enough to remember the LA riots in 1992, after Rodney King was savagely beaten by police and it was caught on camera. He suffered skull fractures, broken bones, broken teeth and permanent brain damage. Those officers just got off scot-free. As a result, the city erupted into riots for a good 2 months until there was a civil suit, which Rodney later won a civil suit. But to me, and those who have a bit of an understanding of history or have proximity to the African diaspora community or the African American community, this present moment, it's better to see it within the context of the last 400 years of the US history. If you have no connection to the African American community or African diaspora community for that matter, you might think that the history kind of goes like this. Some Christians came to America. Slavery happened, it ended, there was an unfortunate period of Jim Crow, and then Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream, and then everything was fine from there. And so we don't really know why people are complaining. But if you've listened to people from the black and brown communities, particularly historians who've done a lot of work in this area, you'll learn that systemic and institutional racism has just morphed and changed over the last 400 years. So for every great gain towards racial justice, there has been a huge backlash against the African American community. Reactions from angry whites and changes of law and policy or tweaks that have helped remind the black community of their second place status. Now, I haven't even touched on the treatment of Indigenous Americans, Pacifica Americans, Asian Americans, because we didn't come here to discuss American racial issues. But what I do want to just drive home is that if we want to learn from this present moment, we need to understand the historical context of this moment. And then we also want to translate this context into the global setting as well. So I've often heard people say to me, oh, this is New Zealand. Why do we need to keep on hearing about America? What about New Zealand issues? What about issue developing country X that we generally don't tend to talk about or care about until this present moment? Well, here's why I think comments like that, on the surface it has merit. Everything doesn't have to be American-centric. But on the other side, I think it's pretty self-serving. Firstly, context. Now, as justice practitioners, people who care about social justice, we are learning about issues such as modern slavery used in manufacturing and agriculture. So we're learning about the context of where do our favourite clothes come from? Where does our chocolate, our bananas, our coffee, the minerals in our cell phones, where do they come from? How do they get there? And we're also learning about our complicity in the injustices that happen as a result of those products because of our consumption. Now, at the same time, we do consume American movies, TV programs, music, sports, theological messages, pastors, worship music, gospel music. But we are reluctant to investigate how our consumption of those goods and services, if you will, could actually propagate racism or harm people. For instance, some of our favourite theologians, pastors and worship leaders are very vocal supporters of the current administration, which is very open and brazen with its racism. The second reason is that people around the world are constantly standing in solidarity with each other. They stand in solidarity, but they also find resonance about what's going on with their own situations, and they reflect on the similarities and differences, but ultimately point the spotlight back to what's going on at home. For instance, tangata whenua have a long history of supporting Indigenous causes around the world. There is a reason why in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have a really great reputation as a leader in academic research for Indigenous peoples. Then more recently, we've had the issues such as Mauna Kea, Standing Rock, Amazon and Pacifica, activists talking about climate change, and they've been supported very well by tangata whenua, as well as other people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. We've also had Indigenous peoples come to ihumātao from around the world to tautoko the kaupapa that's going on there. So global awareness of justice issues is not a new thing. Many of us should know that Gandhi's non-violent resistance was influenced by parihaka. And then Martin Luther King Jr. was influenced by Gandhi. So we can ultimately say, with a bit of pride, that the legacy of Te Whiti and Tohu influenced the strategies that were used by the civil rights movement in the 1960s. We've got the Polynesian Panthers. They were influenced by the Black Panthers in the US. They had care and concern for what was going on with them, but they also looked at what was happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and so they got to work developing food co-ops, homework centres. Pacific academic research grew out as a result of their work, and then they also supported many tangata whenua causes as well. We've got the Springbok protests in 1981. What was happening in South Africa was seen as an important issue for New Zealanders to stand up against. And in fact, one of the black players of that team said that the protests in New Zealand showed South Africa what the world thought about apartheid. So it's really not an argument. It's not a good enough argument to say what's going on in America is too American-centric, because it can help us reflect on what's going on here in Aotearoa. And so if we don't turn from that posture, we're going to miss what God is already saying to us and what He's doing already. So as Christians, how can we position ourselves in this moment? Well, firstly, prophetic imagination. Jesus has given us a ministry of reconciliation. Therefore, as we are crossing boundaries and building bridges, we know that something better is coming, and we can work towards it in partnership with God. So we can ask ourselves questions like, what would a truly racially just and equal society look like? Out of reverence to Christ, what would some Zacchaeus-like moves look like that we can make to bring restoration and healing? Another thing that is really important for us to do is to learn how to bridge the gap of understanding of what the ministry of racial reconciliation, or the ministry of reconciliation rather, looks like in the first place. And to begin to answer the questions that I posed before, we need a common understanding of what it is. Now, for me as a person of colour, with the various identities that I hold and the diverse spaces that I find myself in, I see over and over how your social location influences your perception of what the ministry of reconciliation is. So for those who are benefiting from the status quo, and by the status quo I mean a society which upholds the Pākehā worldview as neutral, as normal, and as preferable or superior, this ministry of reconciliation often looks like an absence of conflict, cross-cultural worship services, diversity consultations, being nice, and moving on from the past. Unfortunately, it does nothing to radically alter the systems and power structures that have produced these divisions in the first place. For those who are actually being harmed by the status quo, who are losing their lives as a result of the status quo, losing their tamariki as a result of the status quo, this ministry of reconciliation requires much more from us. It means courageously confronting the truth of our colonial legacy. It means lamenting, turning from it, and then in partnership with God, working to dismantle all the ideologies, all the ways of being that diminish and oppress Māori and Tauiwi of colour. At the same time, we must plant seeds that will lead to flourishing for everyone. Unsurprisingly, the former group is the one that dominates this conversation, and this gap of understanding of what the ministry of reconciliation is incredibly exhausting, especially for Christians of colour. And for people who are outside of the church, it is a source of scorn that just reinforces the notion that the church is irrelevant to their lived experiences. But it doesn't have to be this way. I believe that God is working through this current moment and inviting us to create something new. So we know that as Christians, we follow a crucified king. We follow one who is victorious, reigning at the right hand of God, but also who identifies with human suffering and has judged the nations, communities, and individuals for abusing and forgetting people on the margins. Therefore, our response in this current moment should be consistent with that. So we need to bring the margins to the centre. This means shifting the focus from the voices who are currently benefiting from the status quo to the voices on the margins who are crying out for justice right now. So, in addition to the voices calling for justice for Black life, we would do well to listen to our Māori academics and students speaking out against racism in our own universities in Aotearoa. We would do well to listen to migrant communities who are speaking about their fears since the Christchurch massacre, which happened last year. We would do well to listen to Indigenous peoples in the Pacific, in the Amazon, and Australia who have been warning us about climate change long before Greta Thunberg. We would do well to listen to our activists in Kaitiaki who've been standing up for their sovereignty at Ihumātao, Mauna Kea in Hawaii, Standing Rock in the US, and our Aboriginal Australian brothers and sisters who have a number of issues they've been speaking about, particularly police brutality as well. Another way that we can help position ourselves as Christians is to change the focus of what we think racism actually is. In this current moment, if we want to see real change, real progress for racial justice, then we need to move beyond the notion that merely interpersonal relationships and personal responsibility is what's going to fix this. We need to begin to reckon with our collective responsibility because although racism is a sin, it is both at the individual level and at the systemic level. So, what are a few practical steps that we can take? Firstly, we can understand what racism actually is. So like I mentioned, it is both the individual prejudices we hold, but it also includes an element of power. It is about the control and use and distribution of resources. That's what undergirds it. Because secondly, race is not real. It is a social construction that had a point in time when it became a thing. And that origin happened as a result of economic gain. It did not start with hatred and ignorance. We need to understand that, and we need to understand where that actually came from. The next thing we need to do is we need to give up this idea, this myth of the perfectly innocent victim. We are all made in the image of God. None of us are perfect. And there is no condition on us for having access to life or dignity. Therefore, particularly as Christians, we should not have any problem in affirming the value of black and brown life without qualifier, explanation, argument, and wavering, regardless as to what people have done. It is not up to us to decide who has to keep their life and who doesn't. Next, we should prepare our minds for this racial justice road ahead. It is a marathon, not a sprint. And as much as it is a social and political issue, it is also very much a spiritual issue. And when we engage in such work, we should expect pushback. We should expect opposition and even outright hostility from even ourselves, from our friends, from our family, from our congregations. Remember, even though Martin Luther King Jr. preached peace, he was still murdered. Number 5, we can start learning or continue learning with intention. This is a kingdom issue. If you haven't already, now is the time to really start pressing in and learning. Learn about the history of racism. Learn about the different experiences of racism. Learn about the different manifestations of racism. It is important that we learn. And it's also really important that we recognize that black and brown theologians, scholars, thought leaders, creatives have been writing and speaking about these issues for hundreds of years. There is a wealth of knowledge out there for us to go and start learning from. We need to push past listening only to the voices that we feel comfortable with. The next thing that we need to do is to learn like a disciple. So that means learn quietly, talk less, listen more. And particularly if you're Pākehā, this is very important because typically Pākehā have not been socialized to have resilience in conversations around race. So it's really important that right now a lot of time is spent listening. Number 7, journey with intention and accountability. Form a small group, a coffee group, a book club group. There are materials out there that you can use to help guide and frame your conversations, that can help lead you through the best materials that you can consume to help broaden your knowledge and help you to have a deeper understanding. You don't want to just stumble around into this. Let's remember Dame Whina Cooper, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, they all had a team around them. They didn't just stumble into victory accidentally. They made a plan and they were held accountable. Number 8, crucify your idol of comfort because discomfort is where the growth happens. Remember that your feelings of discomfort will pale in comparison to the lived experiences of everyday racism that people like I do experience, to the systemic racism that we experience. So now is the time to lean in and, like I said before, grow your resilience in this conversation. Number 9, if you are a leader, particularly a Pākehā leader, lay down your entitlement to power. Start developing an action plan to pipeline diversity into your leadership. Learn how to include more Māori voices in your decision-making process. Actively create spaces for mana whenua to have input into big decisions, particularly if you're in Christian leadership. Number 10, grow your faith. We need God's help to help us envisage a reality where all cultural worldviews and perspectives are respected equally. At the moment, we have the Pākehā worldview dominating and other worldviews are nice to have. That needs to change. God didn't come such that the Pākehā worldview would be the one that he would only relate to us to. God relates to us through all different worldviews of people that he has created. If we struggle to envisage this reality, if we are fearful of this reality, then we need God to help us grow our faith. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for coming for my talk. I know it was definitely something that is quite challenging and not easy, but I'm glad that you sat through it, and I look forward to hearing your pātai.